Are miracles real? What does it take for something to actually be miraculous? Did all this stuff about Jesus in the Bible and that the Bible claims actually happen? How can we know? And how do I share that with skeptics without sounding like a total freak? How can I make a compelling case for Christ without a theological degree? We're going to talk about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, and also, as Evan likes to call me, the Grand Poobah of Theology on Tap, which is where this whole thing was kind of birthed. And I am filling in for Evan McClanahan, who is way better at this host thing than I am, but I'm taking over for today in part 2 of a podcast we started a while back. And I am joined today by Ted Wright, who's basically a modern-day Indiana Jones. He is the founder and director of Epic Archaeology, which is an apologetic ministry dedicated to showing the archaeological and historical trustworthiness of the Bible. He's also appeared in documentaries on the History Channel and CNN, so Google that and see him on those. And of course, Taylor Neill, our friend here at Theology on Air, a rising apologist who came to faith through apologetics while in college, and he's now in his master's program at HBU for philosophical apologetics and teaches at his church high schoolers and grown-ups. And I did not use his official title, was something like Grand Master of the Multiverse or something, but I don't have those notes in front of me. So, and again, I'm Sarah Stone. I do a lot of engaging, talking, sometimes arguing, but most of the time just having really fascinating conversations with what I call fringies, which are people that are kind of on the edge of faith. Maybe they're dipping their toe in the water of this whole Christianity thing. Maybe they're angry about it. Maybe they're apathetic about it. But those are my favorite people. And so we talk a lot. And you are listening to KPFT. And you're also maybe listening on Facebook Live, but KPFT is listener-supported community radio. And so if you like what you hear and you love that you don't have to hear commercials, please help support that. So go to kpft.org to learn more about how you can give, even if it's just a little bit. Mention the name Theology on Air. Give us some love. Maybe we can make it to the full FM station. That'd be pretty cool. We are pre-recording today, so we're not going to do the call-in, but if you happen to be listening on Facebook Live or watching, please chime in with any questions you have for Ted or Taylor or myself, and you can just do that right on the comment thread. But we are hitting up the second part of a podcast about kind of like apologetics for dummies, and we explained what apologetics are in the first one, which is basically just being able to give a reasonable defense for what we believe about this whole Christianity thing. And Ted and Taylor walked us through the first of 4 questions that if you can kind of learn and put in your back pocket, anyone can talk to anyone. So I'm going to ask if one of you would, actually, you know what, before we get to those 4 questions, I want to say this as I was thinking about our last podcast. When we talk about apologetics, one of the big, between recording these 2 podcasts, we were just chatting in the studio about how we all geek out about this kind of stuff. Most of the world does not geek out about this kind of stuff, but there is still this sort of common denominator of its relevance for all of us. So I would just be curious how you guys handle or think about this idea that we can nerd out about apologetics, but where does the line from nerding out about it and actually talking to people about things that really matter, where does that line fall, and how do you keep from just nerding all over everybody, you know?
Great question. You go first.
Okay. Well, yeah, the first thing I would say is there definitely is 2 kinds of people. One kind that thinks this is very, very interesting, and then another kind that's just wrong about that.
Oh, my goodness.
No, but to me, this question is all about purpose and practicality. Why do we do this? Why do we find it important? And for me, that answer is at least partially, and probably, hopefully mostly, because it's because I want people to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus.
That's right.
I mean, that's why we do this. And so how well does it serve that goal if I'm always just kind of staying in the library geeking out about these kinds of things and not learning to actually bring this to people who don't have the same shared interests that I have?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, I would answer it this way. I've been involved in apologetics for, it's going on 20 years now, and as a professor, Bible college, seminary, I've taught it. I've been involved in it. I've been in debates. I've talked to so many skeptics and so many university campuses. And here, the other thing, too, is I've been around a lot of apologists, a lot of people like you were talking about, the people who geek out about this. And here's an observation I've made about what happens and what I've seen happen and what I want to speak to. I think somebody needs to point this out, that we who like this kind of thing, a lot of us sometimes will just preach to the choir. We'll have a favorite argument. We'll have a favorite, well, I'm a presuppositional, or I'm a classical, or I'm a this, or I'm a that.
I'm a little bit rock and roll.
Exactly. So we have these little favorite toy arguments that we like to use, but apologetics is not like that. It's like a tool bag. In fact, Doug Groteis, a professor at Denver Seminary, wrote an article several years ago for the Christian Research, I think it was Christian Research Journal, and I love this article. The article is How Apologetics is Like Jazz. Jazz is improv. It's like, when you have a good group of jazz musicians, and one's at the piano, one's at the, the bass, cello, whatever, you use it's as you go. But apologists, well, this is my argument, I'm going to stick with my argument. No. Your purpose is to show people how to come to Christ and how to come to the truth. And we get so dogmatic and so stuck in these ruts that we're losing sight of the real goal of apologetics, and that is you can win the argument but lose the person. And a lot of times I won that argument. Yeah, but what about that person? You've
lost that friendship.
You've lost that friendship, exactly. Yeah. So I think one of the things that Sarah does so well is that she builds these great friendships, and it's not either the arguments or the friendships, it's both.
Well, it's because you love someone that you have these conversations.
Exactly.
And for me, the apologetic tools are only to get to one more conversation. Because if I can have one more conversation, that implies both the person's interested and also that we actually have a real friendship. Because I care about all of the people that I'm having these conversations with. I think you guys do too. Yes. I've seen you in action. I know it's true. But yeah, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the fact that we are well aware that apologists can go so deeply philosophical that we lose every normal person, and we don't want to do that. And that's actually why we're doing what we're doing today, which is addressing these 4 very simple, I say simple because you can memorize them, that in some ways they're very complex, questions that you can have ready when you're talking to people, so you can have some confidence going into that conversation. So would one of you just spell out for us a review of what the 4 questions are, what we talked about the last time, and then maybe tee off what question number 3 is?
Sure, yes. So in the previous podcast, sir, we covered the 4 basic questions, and the first one was, does truth exist? Is there such a thing as truth? And what is truth? And how do we find truth? Does God exist? And that's a big question. It's a fundamental question. The third question we'll talk about today is, are miracles possible? What is a miracle? Are they possible? Do miracles still happen today? And have they happened in the past? And the fourth question is, can we trust the New Testament? Is the New Testament giving us reliable historical information? Because Christians, the core truth of the Christian claim is that we're here today because we actually believe Jesus physically, bodily rose again from the dead.
That's right.
And where we get that information is primarily from the New Testament.
Which is the second part of the Christian Bible. It's everything that happens from the time that Jesus came on the scene and onward.
That's right. So you got the Old Testament and New Testament, and the New Testament is primarily now there are others, and we'll get into this later today, but the 2 questions we're going to focus on today's podcast are miracles possible, and is the New Testament reliable? So if you can answer, does truth exist? And truth is that which corresponds to reality. We discover truth from the law of non-contradiction, which basically says that 2 opposite statements cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. And then arguments for God's existence, the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, and the moral law, or the conscience. Where does the conscience come from? This little voice inside of your head that says, this is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Where does that come from?
Yeah.
That nature doesn't give that. Only God can give that. So that's kind of where we've come, and now we're on miracles.
Okay, we're on miracles, folks. Here we go. I believe in miracles. Okay, sorry, I had to do it. You sexy thing. All right. Who's going to start us off with, are they possible? Why are we even talking about that?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of quick comments on it,
Sure.
and then we can go as deep or shallow as we want to. So I think how we define a miracle is going to be very important.
Yes.
And, you might have a different, more expanded definition on this. To me, it is just something that is not natural. Okay, so if something is not natural, it's by definition what supernatural, right?
Okay.
So if it doesn't have a natural origin or explanation, then a thing
Mhm.
can be said to be a miracle.
Mhm.
Now, we can get into David Hume and the balancing argument and all kinds of stuff like that if we want to, but what I think is so interesting about this is people that are skeptical about miracles tend to ignore that there is one example of a miracle that's as big as the entire universe. This is something Frank Turek says an
Yep.
awful lot, who's a colleague of Ted's for a long time, so he's heard this before. But one of the arguments we talked about in answering that second question, does God
Mhm.
exist, is the origin of the universe.
That's right.
Right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so that's the origin of nature. All nature began to exist. So whatever caused it is by definition not natural or supernatural.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to piggyback on what you said about the origin of the universe. The greatest miracle is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, let's just lay this out there for folks. There are a lot of, let's just admit, I think we can all admit, there are some pretty wacky, crazy things in the Bible.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Floating axe heads, a guy being swallowed by a fish, a guy
Starts out with a talking
a
snake.
guy building a boat. I mean,
Yeah.
really? Come on. Does this stuff really happen? I mean, all this stuff is kind of crazy. But let's just go back, before we even get to that question, to go back to what Taylor was saying about the origin of the universe. Years ago, I, of course, and Sarah knows this, and no joke, Sarah, that I'm a
We'll
nerd.
see. No promises.
Yeah, I'm a nerd. But I love astronomy, and I love cosmology, and I do a lot of reading, and just for fun, because I think astronomy is amazing. God's creation is amazing. And I came across, and I know, Taylor, you may have heard of this, and Sarah, I'm not sure if you've heard of it. You probably have. It's something called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm.
So what this is they, of course, the Earth is in the Milky Way galaxy, and we're looking out. We're trying to find out. It's kind of like the analogy is, if you are in a forest of trees and you're trying to look out of the forest in the field, you've got to look between all those tree stumps, but to see outside the field. So on the Earth, we're trying to peer through the stars in the Milky Way galaxy to see outside of our universe. And there are only a few places in the night sky who have this so one of them is like I think it's like a third of an inch. So it's equivalent of like the width of a dime. And the Hubble Space Telescope focused its aperture for I forgot how many hours, and they did the exposure, and they found something like 10 to 15,000 galaxies.
Wow.
Just in one little so
Sliver.
if this universe came into existence out of nothing, and whatever created that, things like guys being swallowed by a whale, that's nothing.
That's right.
Resurrections from the dead, that's no problem.
NBD.
Absolutely.
That's no big deal for you
No
guys.
big deal. No big deal. So this question is directly hinged. A miracle's possible. And I know that, when you think about and you're considering Christianity, you are thinking, I know you got to be thinking about that. You're like, what about this? Can I believe this? Well, forget about that for just now. Bracket that question about the whale and all that, and think about the beginning of the universe, and think about the creation of the universe. Because if God can create a universe out of nothing, then He can make all this other little stuff.
Yeah.
Virgin births, it's not a big deal, because these are important to Christianity. And the other thing too, Taylor, that you said is you're talking about the miracles and defining miracles and how that's important, and it's not in nature. The other thing too is the fact that they're irregular. You don't see these happening every day. So something that has to be sort of, this is going to stand out. If something like, wow, where does this come from? Where does these? So it's not a it's not a violation of the laws of nature. It is a suspension of the laws of nature.
So is the reason why we need this third question because we're getting to the point in our conversation with someone, a skeptic, that everything hinges on this whole Jesus thing, Jesus coming back from the dead.
Yes.
And we're trying to preemptively say, whoa, I know you're going to think that's crazy, but let me back it up. I mean, is that kind of why we're
That's
talking about this?
Great point, Sarah. That is exactly right. You're laying the foundation for, because again, as Taylor said earlier, I don't know if it was in this podcast or the previous, it is a cumulative case.
Yeah.
So we're following the argument and the 4 questions for people who are listening. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? You'll notice that the question of miracles is the third question. It's not the first question.
It's contingent on the first
It's
one.
contingent on the first.
Or
So,
the second one.
So if there is a God, then yes, miracles are possible. But if there's not a God, then all bets are off.
That's right.
So.
And let's say something too about miracles. This is a pet peeve of mine. I think in the same way that people use the word love willy-nilly, I love tacos and I love you, I think people do the same thing with miracles, and it bugs the crap out of me. People be like, well, I woke up this morning and it was a miracle. Stop with that. That was not a miracle.
That's right.
Oh, a baby was born. That's beautiful. It's sacred. It's wonderful. Was it a miracle? I mean, it's kind of how we're built to do things, I have a small group of girls that comes to my house every other week for Bible study, and we were talking about miracles, and I asked them all, do you believe in miracles, and have you ever experienced one or witnessed one? Because I will tell you right now, I think miracles are very rare. And so I asked them, and they all nodded their heads. And this is people all on the spectrum of belief. And they all gave examples. All except one of them gave examples of things that are really wonderful and made their lives better. But they weren't a miracle. It was something like, I really needed a job, and then I got a job. Well, that's awesome. But you got a job because certain factors were in place that made somebody want to hire you. That might be and I think what people are doing is they're using it instead of using the word blessing or gift.
Good point.
That doesn't preclude God's actions weren't in
That's
you
right.
getting a job.
That's right. God can be involved in it,
Yes.
but it's not. So I made up this definition like on the fly that night, and I said, I think for it to be a miracle, it has to be supernatural, outside of nature, and it has to point to Jesus, right? If something happens that's outside of nature and it points to Jesus, then okay, I grant you that. And I have heard about miracles, and I'm super skeptical, which is why I think I'm really intrigued by talking to other skeptics. And I want to say that like 9 out of every 10 stories I hear about a miracle, I'm like, but did it happen? Because then you find out afterwards, and we also did chemotherapy. Praised be. It was a miracle. Now he's cancer free. Yes, praised be. But also maybe not a miracle. And that's okay, because God is good, and any good gift comes from him.
Sure.
So anyway, that's my little soapbox, which I will now get off.
But that's interesting. I wanted your perspective because you're the one that is fielding these kinds of questions from fringies, as you call them, way more than Ted and I have an opportunity to. And I do think, at least the people I talk to, it is such a stumbling block because it's used so willy-nilly, as you say.
Yeah.
And, none of us want to be seen as credulous or foolish or anything like that. So even me as a Christian, I'm very careful about what I put my stamp on. It's like, I think that was a miracle.
Yeah.
There's very few instances that I can think of off the top of my head, even though I believe in a God that still does miracles.
And Taylor, you said something the other day that I thought was interesting. Say the thing about even in the Bible, the whole numbers thing. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. So if you count up all the miracles in the Bible, and the amount of history that it purports to cover, then there's only a miracle every 8 years in the Bible.
If you were to average it out.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you average it out.
Some of them
over
are
the time.
clustered up together.
Well, and that's the thing, is that there's very long periods, much longer than 8 years, where there's no miracles, because the miracles tend to cluster around a person, a prophet,
That's right.
to confirm a word of God.
Bingo. That's right.
Bingo.
And that actually fits quite well with what you said. One of the criteria that you put out there is it has to point to Jesus.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. And of course, Christians, we believe the Old Testament miracles point to Jesus also.
That's right.
Because we think Jesus is God, but
That's
I'm getting ahead of ourselves.
That's right, because part of the biblical purpose of a miracle is to confirm a message of a prophet. Here's the thing, there are people out there today, even in our world today, in the modern, in the 21st century, who are claiming to speak for God, who say, well, I got a message from God. Well, in the Old Testament, when you look at the biblical usage of miracles, like, you can say a lot, you can make a lot of outlandish claims, but how do we know you're telling the truth? The Bible gives us, in Deuteronomy, it actually gives us the criteria. If the miracle doesn't happen, or if the prophet doesn't happen, if it's not backed up by miracles, then it probably was not a message from God. So this is going to come into play later when we come to Christ, because Christ made a lot of outlandish claims. He said he was the only Son of God, born of a virgin, and and the whole point is of the Christian message that he rose again. So that's kind of where
After carrying out a ministry of miracles.
Exactly. That's right. That's right.
It's interesting. I think one of the things that bugs me about Christians, and I am a Christian, is when people talk about, well, God told me such and such. This goes along with miracles. People that say something is a miracle when it's not, or they claim to, have a word from the Lord. That's, the funny version of this is that you have some girl that will say to the guy, well, the Lord told me we shouldn't date anymore. And he'll say, well, the Lord told me we should. Well, both those things, according to the law of non-contradictions, can't be true, right? Like one of those things, or maybe neither of those things is true in that case. But and the same goes for miracles. I don't think every time we hear of something that's a purported miracle, we have to be like, oh, well, there we go. There must be a God. That's why I love coming back to the first couple questions about the nature of truth, that it corresponds to reality.
Right, and yet, so we're all rational to be skeptical of miracle claims. At the same time, if you're a fringy, or even if you're a Christian or you're a non-believer, can you really think of a good argument why miracles aren't possible? This actually is really important, because it is such a barrier for a lot of people.
Say that again. Can you think of an argument?
Can you think of a good argument why miracles are not possible? Because any explanation you're likely to give is going to presuppose that God does not exist, right? But that is a different discusussion, right? And that's why this is third in the series of questions instead of second. Because if we've got your buy-in, at least, if you think it's at least possible that God exists, then I think you have to permit miracles also.
Yeah. Because one of the, and Taylor, you touched on this, the main argument, and this is just to lay this out there for folks, one of the main arguments in history against miracles was made by a Scottish philosopher that lived in the 18th century named David Hume. And he, just a couple of points that he made, he said that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. One of the points he made, which is not true, we don't agree with that. It's a suspension of laws of nature. He says firm and unalterable experience have established these laws of nature. He says wise individuals should, or men or women, should proportion their belief to the evidence, which I would agree with. But then he says the proof against miracles is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. But the question is, how do you know what a uniform experience is unless you know everybody's had the same experience?
That's a heck of a claim, isn't it? That claim is kind of hidden in there.
It is. In fact, Lewis says in his book Miracles, he says, unfortunately, we know the experience against miracles to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them are false. Yes. And we know that all these reports are false only if we already know that miracles have never occurred. In fact, he says we're arguing in a circle.
Yeah,
then he says, I can clearly not drink the wine in front of you. Sorry, right. Taylor. Sorry. What were you going to say?
Well, I don't remember now.
I Princess Brided you. I'm sorry.
But but let me go back to this. You touched on this earlier, Sarah, and that is you're talking about worldview, and so there are worldview. Everyone has a worldview. A worldview. The German word is a Weltanschauung, which is basically like glasses. If you put glasses, everyone has a set of lenses that they're looking at the world through. Either there is a God or there's not a God. And what we're trying to say here is that if there is a God, then as you look at the world, the Christian worldview, or the theistic worldview, is a worldview that allows miracles, that miracles are possible. Mm-hmm. There are three religious worldviews, and there's theism, and in theism you've got three theistic religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Now, we haven't dove into that yet, but those three could theoretically be true. We just got to explore them. But there are three religions that believe that there is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial being called God. So that's theism. Pantheism is a belief that God is all. So that would include people like Zen Buddhists or Hindus or New Age folks. And then atheism is a belief that there is no God. So here's the thing. Again, earlier we talked about the law of non-contradiction. And if the law of non-contradiction applies to reality, and if we can establish, and if we have in fact established that there is a God, then by default, pantheism and atheism cannot be true. So that
We're
leaves
just knocking them down left and right, man.
I mean, it's a default thing.
How fast was that?
That was real fast.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you've already knocked out all the other. So you have three religions. Judaism could be true, Christianity could be true, and Islam could be true. And then this is where you go into
something else.
Or something else. Yeah, exactly. But theism, the belief that there is a God, and that's essentially, we're bare bones talking about that now. We haven't gotten to Christianity. We're just talking about theism. And so if you're listening out there, and you're like, well, I don't know about this miracle stuff. All we're trying to say is that if you can establish that God exists and that there is a God, then miracles are possible.
Yeah.
And really, it's almost easier than that if they're making this kind of David Hume type of argument, because if they're willing to admit that they're presupposing that God doesn't exist to get their argument off the ground, then it's easy to show that it's circular, right? Like we just talked about. Mm-hmm. But if they don't presuppose that, then the most you can do using Hume's principle is to say that we shouldn't believe in miracles because miracles are unlikely. We shouldn't believe unlikely claims because they're unlikely, right?
Yeah.
but that is a truism at best. I actually think that's circular also, but it's at
Yeah.
best a truism.
And there's a lot of things that are unlikely that we don't have a lot of evidence for. but
Anybody's
yet-
definition of a miracle, by the way, entails that it's unlikely.
That's true.
Yeah, the origin of the universe out of nothing is unlikely,
Only
but yet
happened
people believe
once.
it. And the origin of the first life was unlikely, but yet we still believe that life somehow evolved or happened,
Yes.
whatever.
All right, I'm going to move us on to the fourth question because I think that's probably where we're going to want to spend the most time. So somebody tell us what the fourth question is and start to unpack it, and then we're going to play around with it a little bit.
So I can just kick us off, and then you can jump in whenever you feel like. So the fourth question is the New Testament reliable?
Okay.
Now, it's not strictly, is the New Testament true, right?
Good distinction,
we're-
yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. But is it reliable as a historical source? And I think for several reasons it is, and maybe that's a good time to kick it to you there, Ted.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I deal with as an archaeologist is so let me define what archaeology is. And folks, everybody loves archaeology, including me. It's why I do it. You've seen Indiana Jones, and that's really not what archaeology is. But we
What?
study
the movies aren't true?
Well, some of it's true.
Just ruined my childhood.
I know. An archaeologist studies the past by looking at material artifacts that cultures have left behind. Historians study the past by looking at written records. So you will have a little bit of crossover. Sometimes we'll find an artifact that has writing on it. So in that case, you'll have an artifact that would be a historical inscription. And the question we want to ask is, here's the fundamental question, because what we're asking, the question is the New Testament historically reliable? And let me just phrase it a different way. How do we know the past period? That's an even more broad question.
But it's an easy one to ask.
It's an easy one to ask. Anyone can ask, well, how do you know the past? And everyone has. When I give talks on college campuses, and Sarah's heard my talk in New Orleans on this, I ask them, does anyone have like a grandparent who was in a famous war or maybe did something really neat, and did they leave you any kind of cool things? Well, I give the example of my grandfather. Growing up, I listened to my grandfather's stories, and he told me he was in a war, and this war was really a very large war. And I was like a kid. I didn't really understand it. As I grew and as I began to understand what my grandfather went through, my grandfather was June 6, 1944. He was on D-Day. Wow. He landed at Omaha Beach, third wave, with the U.S. Navy, with the largest amphibious. So he was an eyewitness, and this is how we know the past. And historians call these primary sources. So we know the past by primary sources, and you can use your own life as an example. My grandfather. So eyewitnesses. My grandfather was an eyewitness. He actually saw it there. He was there when it happened. He lived through it. He drove the boat. He saw the Germans. He fired the guns and all that. And then historical records is the second part of primary sources, and that is he actually wrote a diary. And not only did my grandfather write a diary, but other men from Britain and America and the Germans even wrote diaries as well. They wrote accounts of this. There were official government accounts of it. And then we have the third one is archaeological remains. So if you go today to D-Day, or if you go to Normandy, you can actually see the German positions that are still there today.
And didn't your grandpa also leave photos?
He did. He left photos behind. So I have these photographs, these black and white photographs that my grandfather took and left for me, and my grandmother gave them to me. And so these are all evidence. But here's the thing. In ancient history, you have a document that's purported to be written by an eyewitness. And this is where your professor and a friend of mine, Dr. Michael Kona, who is a professor at HPU, and we talk about one of the things that we want in a historical source is we want something to have been written. It's called, we want early attestation. We want someone who is an eyewitness to have lived either, if not close to the event, lived through the event. We want multiple attestation. We want a lot of people saying the same thing. And another third thing is enemy attestation. So we have people who are not necessarily friendly to the thing, who are agreeing with the exact same account, even though they may have a different account of it. They're saying the same thing. So, for instance, in the situation with my grandfather, it would be Normandy, D-Day. The Germans, we're invading them, but they're agreeing that all these people came across the English Channel and they invaded the coastline. That it happened. Right. Exactly. So we have eyewitness testimony, we have historical records, and we have archaeological evidence. And what we're saying is the New Testament that records the life of Jesus, because think about this claim that we're making as Christians. We're saying that we believe that a guy lived 2,000 years ago, born of a virgin, that he lived a sinless life, at least that's what it's claimed to have lived, and he rose again from the dead. And so the question of history becomes really important. How do we know the past? Well, again, eyewitness testimony, historical records, and archaeological evidence.
And thinking of the World War II example, any one pieces of those evidences that you mentioned wouldn't itself be conclusive.
No.
Right? But you
No.
put it all together, and you've got a good reason, a solid reason to believe that this is what actually happened.
That's right.
And I think, importantly, you've got no good reason not to.
Yes.
So, this is a claim that I make when I'm talking to people, so I'd love to hear from an archaeologist if I'm right about this. But as far as the archaeological record can comment on the historicity of the New Testament, it is favorable towards what is recorded in the
Wow.
New Testament, and in no places does it directly contradict.
In the words of Dinesh D'Souza years ago when he debated an atheist, when he gave it to get the response, he says, "I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. Where do I begin?" That was a great line. No, Taylor, that's a great question. The archaeology of the New Testament, I am what's the word I'm looking for? I am amazed that people like Richard Carrier or people like Jesus mythicists like Bob Price would say things like, we don't have any historical evidence of the New Testament. I mean, it's like years ago I wrote an article.
That's how you know they're commenting outside of their field. When
Totally.
they do that.
Oh yeah, totally. Well, years ago I had a friend of mine who asked me to write a blog, just kind of as a guest blogger. He said, "Could you, Ted, as an archaeologist, could you write an article against Jesus mythicism?" And I said, I was really busy at the time, and I just didn't have time, and I just really didn't want to, but I ended up doing it. And I said, well, I'll do it if I can title the article whatever I wanted. So I ended up naming the article, "What Are Jesus Mythicists Smoking?" So, but the point is that we have got incredible amounts of evidence that the New Testament is archaeologically reliable. It is situated very firmly in the Hellenistic period during the time of Tiberius. I mean, when you read things like for instance, Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. Just listen to this. Listen to how Luke phrases this. "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to the John, the son of Zechariah, in the desert." That's Luke chapter. It doesn't sound like this guy's making this up. He is situating this firmly in history. In fact, the exact date that is we know of this is AD 29. So all 8 people are known from history. They are known to live at this exact time. So we got a document that is very reliable historically and archaeologically. And the other thing too is that we have archaeological discoveries that are made all the time by people that are really not looking to prove the Bible. The most recent example was in 2018. There was an artifact that came out. It was actually excavated in 1967 in a site called Herodium, which is it's actually right near Bethlehem. It's in the West Bank, and it was a fortress that was built by Herod the Great, and it was a palace fortress. And we know that Herod Herod Agrippa was a friend of Pontius Pilate in the Gospels, but the signet ring of Pontius Pilate was discovered in an excavation, and it wasn't deciphered until 2018.
And didn't you tell me offline, too, that a lot of times when these explorers go on a dig, they use the Bible for geographical information to help them?
Absolutely.
I actually just heard a talk by Dr. Craig Evans, who, by the way, when we said something to him in person about the deconversion of these 2 famous YouTube guys, and that the reason why they deconverted is because there wasn't enough it wasn't enough evidence for the Old Testament, he kind of guffawed and went, "Oh my gosh, it's embarrassing how much we have." But he gave a talk recently that said that whether you're a Christian or not, Jewish, atheist, if you're doing an archaeological dig that has to do with the 1st century, you go to one of 5 sources: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Josephus, who was a writer, which I'm sure you guys are going to talk about. But it's pretty crazy. Like, if you're going to spend all that money, because I didn't realize it's tens and tens of thousands of dollars to do an archaeological dig, and it's just a big production. If you're going to do all of that, you want to go where the thing likely is,
That's right.
Let me just say, for those of you listening, we are not doing a live podcast today because this is pre-recorded, but if you're on Facebook Live, feel free to write in and ask us a question. We would love to hear your questions or your arguments, I mean, get feisty with us. We aren't scared. So send them in, and we will do our best to answer them. But I just wanted to remind you guys about that. So kicking it back to you, tell us more about this whole reliability thing.
So let me just mention Tacitus, who is a Roman historian that lived in the first century, and we talked about the primary sources of history. How do we know the past? We know it through eyewitnesses, someone who actually lived through the past, who saw an event, they were there, but we can't witness them. We can't cross-interview the eyewitness. But all we have left are the historical records, the things that left behind, and we have the archaeology. We can study any kind of artifactual remains that it may have been left behind. And let me say, I don't think it was said previously that the New Testament claims to be written by eyewitnesses. Now, whether or not that's true, I hear some people say, well, that's evidence in and of itself. And I would say, yes, it is evidence, but there's no way to know if the evidence of an eyewitness is true unless we can actually back it up. Let me give you one more example, Sarah, of how this works, and in just an everyday example. And you've heard this before as well. In 1912, there was a very famous, and I'll ask Taylor this, a very famous ship that sank in the Atlantic Ocean. And what was the name of the ship?
It started with a T.
Yeah.
And with Titanic.
Wasn't Leonardo DiCaprio on that ship?
Yes, he was.
And Kate Winslet was on there as well.
Yes.
No, that's right. It was the Titanic in 19...
I apologize for these dad jokes coming your way, folks. Mercy.
We take a bow, Taylor.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there was a lady named Eva Hart. She was 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her mom and dad, and of course her father sadly passed away in the sinking of the ship because many of the men on the ship gave their places in the lifeboats to the women, and she lost her father. But as a 7-year-old girl, she remembers rowing away from the boat as it sank, and she remembers distinctly that the ship broke in half. And then there were other eyewitness accounts who said that the ship just sank. So here's an instance in which we have two eyewitness accounts that are telling us contradictory things about what actually happened. And so what is the only way that we can determine if Eva Hart was right about the ship breaking in half?
Ooh, I know. Raise his hand.
Yes.
We got to find the ship.
We got to find the ship.
That's right.
And in 1987, oceanographer Robert Ballard went to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
I thought it was James Cameron.
No, yeah, he wasn't him. Bob Ballard found it first. And sure enough, the ship had broken in half. So here's an example of how archaeology can actually affirm the historical eyewitness accounts and say, you know what? But here's the thing. The eyewitness accounts are both right about the sinking of the ship. They differ on the details, but that is one of the earmarks of eyewitness accounts, that they might differ here and there, but they agree on the core idea, and that is the ship sank.
You go.
Well, I was just going to say that's so important to the discussion that we're having, because a lot of times I've heard it said to me when I'm talking to folks, well, the Gospels, they tell different versions of the story. They contradict each other. How could you possibly trust them? Well, that's typical of eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
They agree and converge on central facts, and they differ on minor details.
Yeah, J. Warner Wallace is another apologist that talks about this. He is a former detective, and he talks about if he is talking to eyewitnesses at a crime scene, he wants them to have different stories, slightly different stories, because that actually shows that they haven't gotten ahead of time together and been like, what's our story? You know,
That's right.
It's more reliable when there are small differences. But I will say this too, as you study the Bible, and if you're not studying the Bible, get in a Bible study with some people that you trust, because you'll also find that each of the four Gospels, those are just the four accounts of what happened with Jesus in his life, written by different people. They each have a different audience. They each have a different voice. These are real people that lived in real time. And so one of them may be writing to, say, the Jewish population, to say, like, no, he really was, he really is God. And so I'm going to talk to you and appeal to your Jewishness, and I'm gonna aim my story that way. Somebody else might be like, listen, I wasn't actually there, but I've really gotten all of these testimonies together. That's Luke.
Which coincidentally explains a lot of the differenents in the testimony.
That's what I'm getting at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
They had different goals. They were highlighting different features of the story and so on.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So, Sarah, you mentioned the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of course. And Luke wrote not only the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts, which followed the Apostle Paul and Peter on their missionary journeys. And Taylor, you mentioned this too about geography. There was a book years ago, and I actually bought it because it was very expensive. I had to save up my pennies for this book. It's by a Roman historian by the name of Colin Hemer. He wrote a book called the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, in which, as a Roman historian who knew the Mediterranean, the ancient Mediterranean world that Paul would have been familiar with, he followed their travels and he followed the historical trail and found 84 geographical exact places like the prevailing winds off the coast of Malta, when they dropped the anchor off, the depth of the water. We're talking about someone who knew details that only an eyewitness would know.
That's interesting.
Years ago, there was a lawyer who wrote a book on Paul's G.F. McClear. This is years ago back, and he talks about these certain Roman governors like Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Quirinius, Pontius Pilate, Felix, Festus, Sergius, Paulus, and another one by the name of Gallio. Well, the order in which Luke places these in the book of Acts is the exact order that the Roman historian Tacitus puts them in. So we're talking again about someone who is very careful about constructing the history that he's writing about. And so by reason of inference, we can deduce that if he's giving us accurate historical information about the Roman world at the time, he's also giving us accurate information about Jesus of Nazareth. That if he's right about this, and he's very likely right about Jesus.
Yeah.
And if you're going to say otherwise, you owe some kind of argument to that.
Totally.
That's true. That's fair. The other side has to make an argument sometimes too.
Yeah, I think we forget that. We play an awful lot of defense when we're talking about the Gospels and explaining why we do think that they're historically reliable and everything. But, when you lay it out just like you did, he's proven trustworthy on these things. So why is it only these other things that he's lying about? Well, I've given you some evidence. Give me a reason to not believe that.
Well, yeah, and if the real crux of the whole thing, pun intended, is that Jesus is the linchpin, right? If Jesus really did live, if he really did die, and then, of course, the big one, if he really did rise from the dead and ascend, I guess that's a 2-for-1. If that really did happen, then everything else that we're talking about matters so much. And if somebody wants to come back then and say, here's the thing, no one's really going to have a problem with that he lived or that he died. The problem is going to be that he came back from the dead. And I think then we can say, okay, if you don't think he came back from the dead, how do you explain that hundreds and hundreds of people saw him and touched him, ate with him? And it'd be interesting to hear what their answers were to that.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of my very favorite approach in talking about the resurrection of Jesus, which was developed originally by a guy named Gary Habermas.
Yep.
Hey.
And
minimal facts.
Yeah, the minimal facts. And so as a historian, the idea behind this argument is that he can establish that I've seen him formulate it with 6 facts and more. I've seen him formulate it with only 3 facts. But the point is the same, and that is that each of these facts are historical bedrock, which means that they are accepted by the majority of believing New Testament scholars and skeptical and atheist New Testament scholars. So they have universal acceptance, universal appeal, right? And one formulation that I like a lot is the first fact is that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. On the Sunday after his crucifixion, his tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers.
Yay, women! First apologists.
That's right.
First evangelists,
The disciples and groups of people had experiences of Jesus after his death. And then finally, last fact on this, the disciples were willing to die
That's right.
for the truth of that belief, when presumably they could have either recanted or just disappeared, stopped proclaiming the gospel, and not themselves have been tortured and killed.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so when you have those basic facts that are historical bedrock that everybody accepts are true, you look at that and say, what best explains all of those facts?
Yeah.
And for me, it's pretty difficult to think of any other explanation than Jesus is who he claimed to be.
Yeah, it's sort of like, what's the most reasonable answer to this? It's not even just, well, it's got to be true. It's like, well, just given all the options, it just makes the most sense.
Yeah, Taylor, to go back to what you were saying about the disciples, and this is something that Frank Turk and I, he talks about this a lot, and I remember talking about it a lot when I worked for Cross-Examine, and that is that the apostles the disciples, they didn't have a lot to gain by making this up. So if someone wants to say, well, you know, they just made this up. Well, okay, heck a minute. What did they all just, you know, build a villa, you know, in Italy and say, you know what, we're just going to retire? No,
You know
they
what
were.
would be fun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they were all.
let's
This
get
would be fun.
ourselves crucified.
They were all just absolutely just persecuted, stoned to death, hung on a cross. If they're making it up, they didn't have anything to gain. The other thing too is that the Gospels themselves contain embarrassing things that if you're going to make a story up, you're going to make yourself look good. But it includes all kinds of crazy stuff, like even Jesus, like Peter denies Christ 3 times. The disciples run away. They're presented as cowards. The women were the brave ones, you know, and not the guys. Yeah. But in that culture, that would have been a big thing. You're going to make yourself, oh, we were there and we believe Jesus. But
well,
no,
it wouldn't have helped you spread your story because that testimony wouldn't have been considered credible.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if you're trying to
Those
spread a
emotional
lie,
women.
you want to put some credibility behind it, you know?
That's right. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his own family. He was deserted by many of his followers.
Tells Peter, he says, "Get behind me, Satan."
That's right. Yeah, it calls him Satan.
I mean, that's embarrassing for the Jerusalem church, considering Peter was the leader of it.
Absolutely. Jesus was thought to be a deceiver. He was a madman, a drunkard, demon-possessed. All these things. He allowed his feet to be wiped with the hair of a prostitute. All these things just don't fit into the scenario of something being made up. And you wouldn't include this in the Gospels unless it actually happened. So, again, as we've said before, and I think it's worth repeating, it's not any of these one things that actually makes the case that Christianity is true, but when you take all of it together, it really makes a compelling case that there's probably something going on here. Something happened 2,000 years ago that really shook these people up. They saw something, they experienced something. And the other thing, too, all the disciples were Jews. So before Jesus, before the resurrection, they all followed animal sacrifice. They followed the law of Moses. They followed the Sabbath. They were monotheists. They believed that God was one. They believed in a conquering Messiah. They all believed in circumcision. But then after the resurrection, the Christ sacrifice was it. His life, not the law of Moses. Not that it's against it, but then they believed in the Trinity. They're Trinitarian.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so important that they had no expectation of a dying, let alone rising
That's right.
Messiah.
And Jesus, the brother of Jesus, can you now the earthly brother of Jesus, the half brother of Jesus, and when I was on CNN several years ago on a documentary called Jesus Faith Fact Forgery, that's one of the questions they asked me on the documentary was how do we explain James, the brother of Jesus? Because if you think about it, I mean, just put yourself in James' perspective. I mean, maybe your sister, your brother, like my brother thinks he's the Son of God, you know. It's like, yeah, let's get him out of here, you know. He's embarrassing. But something happens where James has a complete 180 and
What
completely
would it take
turns around.
for you to believe that your brother was God?
Wow, so many things I'm not going to say right now.
And he becomes the head of the church in Jerusalem and is martyred for believing that.
Well,
Something happened there.
We're talking about all of these things that happen in the Gospels, and then you have almost the rest of the rest of the New Testament is written by Paul, who had zero reason to come on board, right? I mean, he was doing great persecuting Christians. He was, highly esteemed. He was making bank. I mean, the guy was doing really
right.
well, and there's no reason why he'd be like, you know what I want to do? Be despised. Well,
I
no,
wanna
let's not
leave all
stop
my
there. Let's go to
privilege
jail.
behind.
Let's
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
shipwrecked, and then I'm going to die as a martyr, and people are going to think I'm crazy. That's just another kind of nail in the coffin. Like, come on, there's no way.
So, I'm gonna play skeptic for a second, though,
Uh-oh.
because I know somebody out there is thinking it, and
Okay.
so I want to address
Say
it
it.
for them, even though I don't think it's a good objection. But somebody is thinking, well, you know, we don't even have the signatures, the original documents, right? What we have is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and then they're going to use, more than likely, some example of the version of the game telephone, right?
Yeah.
I tell you
Yeah.
a secret, you tell the next person, you tell the next person. By the time it gets back to me, it's unrecognizable.
Right.
Right. So that's the way the Bible developed, and so how do we even know the original?
Yeah.
So I don't know how
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we would establish reliability, just like I said. We have early testimony. We have we have early manuscripts. We have multiple. We have early attestation, multiple attestation, and we have enemy attestation. So the closer the documents to the events, the more reliable the documents are. And so we've got fragments that date to the 2nd century. We thought we had one in the 1st century, but it turned out not to be. But in the words of Dan Wallace, who is a professor of New Testament Greek at Dallas Seminary, and he is also the director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, he said, today we have an embarrassment of riches with manuscripts in regard to the New Testament. He also said something very interesting in a book about the New Testament reliability. He said that even if we didn't have the early manuscripts, which we do, we have an incredible amount of manuscripts, like 28 or 29,000 manuscripts in different languages like Latin and Syriac.
And like 6,500 Greek
manuscripts. Yeah. But he said even if we didn't have that, so you got the Apostle Paul and you got the early disciples, but the guys that immediately follow them, the church fathers like Ignatius and Polycarp, they're called the early church fathers. That's right. They're quoting the New Testament. They're quoting something earlier than them. And so Dan Wallace basically said we can reconstruct the New Testament 100 times over just from the quotations from the patristic fathers alone, even if we didn't have the manuscripts.
And you'd think if it developed like a game of telephone, the stories would start to diverge a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Given enough time, they would just explode into differences.
These multiple attestations all keep that historical bedrock, that center.
That's right.
That one truth.
Okay, I have to put this in there because we have our modern day Indiana Jones here, so we have to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
Tell us something about that. Like, does that help our case?
Yes, absolutely it does.
Tell us a little bit what the Dead Sea Scrolls, how were they discovered, and what's the significance?
So in 1947 in the Dead Sea, so if you go south of Israel, you see that large body of water in the southern part of Israel, known as the Dead Sea, there is an archaeological site called Qumran. It's called Khirbet Qumran. It's an Arabic word which means a ruin. And there's two major different kinds of sites in Israel and Jordan and the Transjordan. And one is called a tell, Tell, and the other one is called a Khirbet. And a tell is an artificial mound that's a city that's been built up over time. So it's like a layer cake. So they would build the city, it would be destroyed, people would come back, build on top, and you'll have a city that has like 5 or 6 layers that are sequenced over time. So a very famous tell is Tel Megiddo, which is where the site of Armageddon is going to be, purportedly, in the northern part of Israel.
That's a different podcast.
And then the other site is called a Khirbet. And so the ruins they're not really built up. They have some layers, but they're not like over time. It's more of just a ruin laying on the surface. So Qumran is we believe it was the place where the Essenes, which were a group of Jews that lived in the first century, during a period in Jewish history called the Second Temple period that began approximately 200 BC, going all the way to the time of the Herod the Great. And so there were basically 3 groups of Jews that lived in the first century. There were the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. The Dead Sea Scrolls, there's different theories about this, but when the Romans came into Jerusalem in 70 AD, they were going to just clean house. And so what's believed is that the Jews either in Jerusalem or there at the community of Qumran hid these scrolls. And in 1947 there was a Bedouin shepherd looking for a lost sheep, and he threw a stone up into a cave, and he heard the stone break a piece of pottery or something. He climbed up there and found a jar lid opened up, and there was this scrolls.
I didn't realize that's how they were found.
That's how they found. It's really cool. And so when he took these scrolls out, they took them to, and they were actually, I actually read and heard from someone else, another source, that they were actually going to burn them and use them for fire. Yes. But
sorry.
one guy talked him out of it. And his name, the guy who, if my memory serves me correctly, Muhammad el-Dib, Muhammad the Wolf was his nickname. He was a shepherd, from Bedouin shepherd. They went to Amman, Jordan, and they actually put
That's a heck of a nickname for a shepherd.
It is, yeah, the wolf. It's like the wolf guarding the sheep. Yeah. But anyway, he went to Jordan, and these scrolls went on the black market, and a guy who recognized the scrolls, where did you get these? He told them where he got them, and then there was a race between the antiquities authorities in Jordan and the archaeologists and the Bedouins, because the Bedouins wanted to get rich, and there really was not a lot of regulation. It was like the Wild West. Yeah. So then it was like a quest between who was going to get to the scrolls first. And so that was cave 1, and they've eventually found, now there's like 12 caves, and so it's a bunch of biblical manuscripts, many Old Testament manuscripts. The most significant manuscript that was discovered is the complete scroll of Isaiah that dates to about 200 BC, and we're talking about it's 99.9% exactly. When you get your copy of Isaiah out and you're opening up your NIV or your ESV, and the Dead Sea Scroll book of Isaiah is 99.9% exactly what you have in your Bible, which shows us that the Masoretic tradition of tribal transmission of these manuscripts is very reliable. So you have a very reliable copy of the Old Testament.
But maybe this is a good spot to add in why it's so important, though, that we have such numerous manuscript evidence. Because, you and I have both kind of talked about that a little bit. And say I don't want to grant you that, verbal transmission was reliable and that scribal transmission was, very good. Mm-hmm. How do we argue that? And, one of the things that I think both of us would point to is the manuscript evidence. We mentioned we have 6,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and we have almost 30,000 manuscripts total. And then you compare that to other ancient documents from history that we all seem to accept.
That's right.
And that's where the embarrassment comes in our riches.
Exactly. To go back one other point too, and this is for the
we
folks,
only have a few minutes left.
Okay,
just
this is
FYI.
a really important point because for people, this is for your back pocket apologetics. I guess we're using that term. If you're out there, and you're like, well, how can I don't remember all this stuff? Well, I'll tell you a very easy way to remember why we believe that the New Testament was written early. And I'll ask you guys this.
Ooh, I think I know.
What is the most important traumatic event that happened in the first century?
The sacking of the temple.
The sacking of the temple of Jerusalem. Paul, everybody agreed, even liberal scholars would agree that Paul's writings, his letters, were written later than the four gospel writers. But Paul nowhere mentions the destruction of the temple, which means that Paul's letters were written before 70 A.D., within the time period of the eyewitnesses.
Can I chime in here?
Yeah.
That would be like, so for those of you that are like, whoa, they're saying a lot of dates and times and places, I don't know, all these things. It would be like if someone were writing a history of New York City in, the early 2000s, and they just left out the fact that the Twin Towers were hit.
Great example.
This doesn't happen. I mean, it doesn't matter which newspaper you go to in, the fall of 2001. You're going to hear, now you'll hear different versions of it. Like Britain is saying different things than the people right on the ground are saying, than people in different states are saying, but they're all referencing it.
Right.
So that this isn't referenced means that everything we have must have been written before that.
And
great example.
Right. And going along with the former example you were making, it's not contested anywhere. That's important too when they're all telling the same. But we actually have quite good evidence that Paul was martyred by Emperor Nero in AD 62. Mm-hmm. And yet he refers to passages in Luke as scripture.
That's right.
So Luke was
it had
in
to have come
circulation.
before that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
because we're getting close to being out of time, I want to wrap this up a little bit with a bow. And it's not all things are so simple, but we've gone through these 4 questions that if you can kind of ruminate on and then talk with people about, you can get pretty far in making a pretty credible claim for Christianity. And so in this last question, is the New Testament trustworthy or reliable? Give us just a couple quick handholds that we can say, one reason I think it's reliable is, give me a 1-sentence, something you could say to a skeptic that obviously would open it up to more conversation. What would that look like?
so this is going to be a run-on sentence.
Okay. I'll allow it.
Yeah. But what I would say is I would just challenge them, because I'm really confident about this. Just subject it to the same level of scrutiny that you would any claims from the ancient world. And, apply the same academic methods. This is called textual criticism. Apply the same methods that you would to any ancient document and see how the New Testament fares.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what you're going to find out is there's really only 2 instances in Scripture of more than 2 passages that we're unsure what the original said.
Wow.
We have 99.8% certainty, historically speaking, that we have what the original authors wrote.
Yeah. It's good.
Yep.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we have, to answer the question, we have we have ample amounts of historical evidence the Bible's true, with the manuscripts, the number of manuscripts, the early manuscripts, and we have the archaeology. And when we have the archaeology and you have the manuscripts together, they make a compelling case that we can actually trust what the New Testament's telling us.
Yeah. And speaking of archaeology, I don't know when this podcast will air, so if it airs after this, pretend like this next sentence is not happening. But on April 14th, our next Theology on Tap, Ted Wright is going to be joining us to talk, along with some other scholars, about this very thing. How does archaeology, quote, prove, I'm using that word a little tongue-in-cheek, the Bible? And you get to hear some more Indiana Jones cool stuff. So, but we are just about to wrap up. So before we do, review for us quickly what the 4 questions are, just if we have forgotten. What are the 4 questions?
Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament reliable?
And if you have fallen asleep during part of this, the answer to all of those is yes. Okay, so tell us where we can find you guys if people want to argue with you or learn more about you. Where can they find you, Taylor?
I just want to give a little extra credit. If you want the Old Testament thrown in, Jesus affirmed it.
Hey!
There you go. If Jesus is who he said he was, which is the case we made, then you get the Old Testament thrown in.
It's like a BOGO.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You can find me at neillology.com. That's neillology.com. You can also email me, same address, neillology@gmail.com.
Okay, and
Find
Ted?
me, Ted at epicarchaeology.org, and we're also on YouTube as well. Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Epic. See, there's a double meaning there, guys. It's epic, like it's super cool, but also it's an epic.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
pretty cool. And of course, we would love for
I
you to.
thought you were the nerd between the two of you.
Oh, I'm a nerd in disguise. Yeah. Of course, you can also find Theology on Tap folks at our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston, or in the Twitterverse, as Evan says, at Houston TOT. Keep engaging with us, keep listening to us, and until we all meet again, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.